Thank you for visiting. Listen, David, as I grew older, I became the heir to a heritage that had been passed down through many generations. I inherited not just cash, but also the weight of my family's company. So my life had always been structured in a certain manner. Despite my family's aspirations, our $16 billion empire failed to live up to only a company. It was a family legacy. I am the heir apparent. My father, Nicholas James Mateo, resigned not long ago. As I firmly grasped your hand and solemnly pledged to preserve our family's legacy, I was fully committed to doing just that. And for boardrooms, profit margins, and relentless schedules appeared to be the only things going on in my life until the tragedy. A jumble of exploding noises, shattered glass, and ear-piercing agony I can't. When I awoke, all I could recall was the frightened sounds of others and the blazing lights of the ambulance. Even though my body was in terrible shape when I arrived at the hospital, my mind was as clear as it had ever been. Maybe it was the shock of meeting Dr. Charlotte was a stroke of luck, or maybe it was destiny leading me to the help I needed. Charlotte was very self-assured and completely unlike any woman I had encountered in my social circles. Jones, she treated me like any other patient, her manner professional and unconcerned about my name or the riches behind it. I'll never forget the first time she stepped foot in my room. Her serene aura permeated the clinical setting, and her keen gaze pierced the air. Her Mateo, you're fortunate to be alive. Yet you were evaluated clinically by her brisk tone. Must adhere to prescribed procedures for complete recovery. No one had ever addressed me in such a manner prior to my. I was used to receiving compliments with open arms, but Charlotte's candor piqued my interest as I proceeded through. I was looking forward to our contacts throughout treatment and recovery, since she would stop over to see how I was doing and bring her white. With her coat dangling from her waist and a clipboard in her hand, she never once acknowledged my identity outside of my medical progress. In the beginning, I attempted to woo her with my admiration for the hospital walls. Charlotte remained unfazed. She erected a barrier around herself when I made a seemingly innocuous remark or joke. Couldn't break through with wealth or social standing. It only motivated me to work more. It took time, but I did see hints of. Charlotte felt profoundly for her. Yet beyond her business facade, she was a nice person. I was extremely patient and worked very hard to make sure they had the finest treatment possible. One day, while we were discussing my rehabilitation plan, I discovered a short but genuine smile on her face as I spoke to her. It gave me hope, and I eventually asked her out on a date. She paused before being dismissed, which caught me off guard. I don't believe it's suitable, Mr. Mateo. I gently reminded her to call me Edward and asked that she speak in a more confident tone. She grudgingly agreed that the first meal was merely supper and that there were no expectations. Charlotte's warmth, humor, and intelligence were unexpectedly endearing once she let her. Unguarded, she shared with me her experiences in medical school, her challenges as a newly minted doctor, and her aspirations for founding a clinic for low-income neighborhoods, and I was enthralled by her enthusiasm for what she did for a living. A manner I had never encountered before. Charlotte, our connection was first fraught with difficulty, was skeptical, wondering if we were from other planets, but I felt a newfound resolve for the first time in my. I spent a year pursuing what seemed like a genuine person or anything in my life. Finally, however, we exchanged vows in a little ceremony that seemed completely apart from the enormity of the grandeur with which I was familiar. Made Charlotte's modest wedding dress pop, and her radiant smile illuminated the room as she was more than just my wife when I put the ring on her finger. She was also my rock, my companion, and my greatest source of strength. Experienced the thrill of a lifetime when, 2 years after we tied the knot, Charlotte and I welcomed our daughter into this world. She came full circle. She was our savior. She was the ideal embodiment of both the lady I loved and my aspirations for a fulfilling life. She went back to work at the hospital, but it wasn't before she cradled our daughter, who was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. I thought life was great for a time when Grace managed to juggle being a mother and a doctor. Managed the company, Charlotte showed great patience, and we both value the family time we had. But gradually, There was a noticeable change when Charlotte began returning home later, becoming more absorbed and emotionally aloof, even while she was physically there. Attempted to give her some space, reasoning that her intense work stress was to blame. After all, she had always been so enthusiastic about her work. I used to admire her work ethic, but then one night I caught her laughing on the phone, and I couldn't help but. Hadn't had any communication on it for weeks. When I inquired, she said that a co-worker had dismissed my interest, describing it as strange. I trusted Charlotte for a while, but eventually I let it go, and the number of late nights she required increased. Our kids started to wonder why Mama wasn't coming home for supper anymore, which caused tension in our family. I saw David when I went to see her in the hospital one day in an attempt to surprise her. David was the ex-boyfriend Charlotte had mentioned to me while we were dating, and I knew his name right away. I'd cradled her while she struggled through medical school, but he abandoned her just when she needed him most, shattering her heart. Shared those heartbreaking experiences, assuring her that she deserved more, and now he found himself employed as an accountant. On that fateful night, I approached Charlotte at her hospital as we were joking like old times. Her expression went from bewildered to momentarily still as I demanded an explanation as to why she had failed to inform me that David had a job at the hospital. I was worried she would say no, but she just sighed and said, "Edward, it's not a big deal." Hello, I was just irritated with a coworker, but that's in the past. Rising to the surface because, as of late, it has seemed as like I'm vying for your attention in the same way that your work has. It seems like your ex-boyfriend Charlotte was also angry. That's absurd. You're being paranoid, David. Seems meaningless to me. Then why does he appear to get more attention from you than we do? I just got home from work, Charlotte, and our. When I said, "My daughter misses you and I miss you," she became defensive and accused me of failing to comprehend her. I attempted to maintain composure, but the words just wouldn't stop coming out about the stress of my job and the difficulty of juggling everything. It seemed like she was fading from my sight as I watched her converse with a guy who had broken her heart in the past, sharing smiles and tears. She broke her heart by telling me all about the ways he wronged you. I tried to be more understanding by speaking more softly of him, and yet here we are. Can you not see the impact on my emotions? A fleeting look of shame crossed Charlotte's face, but it was short-lived. I have no say over who works at. Edward and I are unable to put our careers on hold each time you experience insecurity. I was shocked to hear this from the hospital. This has nothing to do with insecurity. Rather, it is a matter of respect for our family, myself, and the disagreement progressed from our pledges to each other, with each of us stating things we didn't intend, or maybe we did. But by the time it was over, Charlotte had stormed off to her bedroom, leaving me standing alone in the living room, and the results were disastrous. It was that night in the nursery when I sat with my chest constricted with anger and pain, lulling our little girl to sleep. I couldn't help but be perplexed by what became of the life that Charlotte and I had envisioned for ourselves. My love for her was immense, but I experienced a newfound vulnerability in the bedrock of our marriage. Something had to give. Either we discovered a solution or we drifted apart, would only widen, and the anguish of losing Charlotte or both of us was something I wasn't sure I could handle the weight of Charlotte and my growing apart. Our silence had become a language in and of itself. Every day seemed like a rerun of the previous one, with her sleepless nights, meaningless justifications, and Charlotte's absence was becoming more noticeable, and I clung to the hope that things would improve between us, impacting our family, yet nothing was done until, after yet another late meal apart, I finally snapped when she drew near the door, weary and uninterested. I knew it was time to strike up the discussion I'd been putting off. Despite my fear of Charlotte, I started speaking clearly. We really must speak. Would this have to wait? I told her forcefully, no, it can't wait. I've had a long day, as she brushed by me to set her bag on the counter. Charlotte is beginning to attract our daughter's attention, and she constantly questioning why you're not spending more time at home. This cannot continue. I'm doing my best, Charlotte said, her irritated eyes darting in a different direction. Edward, you were aware that I married someone who wouldn't put her needs first because of my demanding work. I snapped out at her, stopping her in her tracks. because of her ex-boyfriend and his issues with her own family. Are we? Edward David's wife has passed away, and his kid is having a hard time. What should I do? Ignoring that, certainly I. When I raised my voice to tell Charlotte that she is not his wife and that she is not a member of his family. You're taking it upon yourself. He's alone, she said, her voice rising as she approached him. Edward David is drowning, and his kid needs stability. I'm only trying to assist, yet in doing so, you fail to comprehend. Our daughter seldom sees you, and I stated it in a strong but controlled tone since you're leaving your own family. Charlotte threw up the towel, saying, I don't think that's fair to her or us. I raised my voice to tell you that this is not about you, Edward, but about doing what is right. David is not an issue of yours. He has taken his decisions and must now face the consequences of them. She clenched her jaw and yelled out, You're heartless. How could you stand there and say that when you're clearly not his support system? I'm not cold-hearted when it comes to children, I retorted. I'm pragmatic, and I know that David has to. Charlotte crossed her arms and looked at him with piercing eyes, pleading for him to take responsibility for his kid instead of depending on you. I say incredulous because it takes a certain level of empathy to comprehend why this matters to me. Does not imply giving up your own family to save another's. You seem to be preoccupied with rescuing David to the detriment of us. Is it even possible for you to see that the argument escalated from that point on, with each of us venting our anger and accusations into the air was charged with a fiery intensity when Charlotte finally spoke, her words piercing my heart. Perhaps you're just envious, Edward, envious that I would prioritize the needs of another person above yours. I looked at her in shock, and I repeated, I speak in a barely audible whisper because this has nothing to do with envy, Charlotte. It's all about the reverence that each of you has for me and our marriage. And as for the family we've created, she said nothing. Instead, she remained still, arms crossed and mouth set. There is nothing else to say after a lengthy, uncomfortable quiet, if that is your interpretation. I stormed out of the room, my chest constricted with pain and rage, and I slept in the guest room that night, unable to muster the strength to lie in bed with someone who seemed so distant as I lay there, gazing up at the ceiling. I loved Charlotte, but it wasn't enough to keep me from wondering whether this was our last chapter. I couldn't bear the thought of her repeatedly putting her partner's needs above her own family's. I had every intention of making Mason's 5th birthday a happy celebration, but it has turned out to be everything but. Create an unforgettable experience for her. But the day took a surprising turn when she awoke wan and listless, her little body sluggish. My body ached from the fever, and I knew something was really wrong. I attempted to contact Charlotte in the hopes that she would return home and assistance, but she remained silent. I rushed to get Mason in my arms and rushed to the hospital to see her since I couldn't wait any longer. Took her to the ER without delay, and as I waited there clutching my baby, I managed to get through too. My voice was tight with haste as I told Charlotte that I was at the hospital with. Oh great, you're already there, Mason said before I could continue speaking. David, his kid, and I haven't eaten anything all day. So could you please swing by the cafeteria and get some food for 3 of us? Shocked, I believed I misunderstood her request that she just deliver sandwiches. Her nonchalant tone made it seem as if I hadn't just said that I was in the hospital with our baby. Still, I couldn't help but feel. Charlotte, I spoke these words with an icy, piercing tone as my wrath surged swiftly and relentlessly. Edward, I'm pretty busy. Would you want to chat later? I didn't think you cared why I was here. My daughter was unwell, and Charlotte was doing everything she could to help her. So I hung up the phone shaking with anger. I felt like I had lost touch with the lady I had married as I thought about providing for David and his children. Mr. Mateo, your daughter's doctor arrived not long after. His attitude was somber, and I felt my heart sink. Her kidneys are deteriorating. Therefore, she has to begin dialysis right once. She will also need a... The room spun, my breath caught in my throat, and the words transplant as soon as possible struck me like a freight train. I took hold of Mason's little hand and felt her delicate neck. What on earth could be happening? My thoughts were aroused as I saw her serene but pale face as she lay on the hospital bed. I had to keep my composure in the face of a deluge of competing ideas so that she might be the kind of mom Charlotte needed. I wanted to contact Charlotte again to explain what was occurring, but I was too angry to do so if she wasn't available. Why did she put her own daughter's needs ahead of those of another family? As Mason was being prepared for dialysis, I kept my promise to do whatever was necessary to save her. She was my whole universe, and I would never let her down, no matter the cost. It was without Charlotte's presence in the hospital room that I felt a sense of powerlessness as I saw Mason's fragile body attached to various devices. I had no idea what a lively, happy, and energetic young girl my daughter had become until she, battling for her life, it was a harsh truth to confront, and the time seemed to drag on forever as I waited. I was waiting for Charlotte to return my call, expecting that she would finally see the seriousness of the issue, when my phone suddenly buzzed. I was taken aback when I heard Charlotte's voice instead of my anticipated worry or perhaps panic. David and his son were involved in an explosive incident that broke the line. "Edward," she said, "you humiliated me. Who the fuck ignores people as they wait for food?" Her comments were like adding fuel to an already. As I tried to maintain my cool and speak softly to Charlotte, my jaw clenched and my grasp on the phone became more tense, shaking with rage. "Are you even aware of what's going on here? Are you concerned? You're the one who doesn't seem to care, isn't she?" Yelled out at Edward. "You're selfish. You never think about anyone else." I rose up suddenly, the chair clacking noisily on the clean floor, and my grip on TI became more finicky. A fist and, for an instant, the want to strike out, but I restrained myself by taking a deep breath and working through Our daughter, I continued between clenched teeth, is in the intensive care unit. My voice remained steady, but every word came out sounding like a snarl. Her kidneys are deteriorating, and she may not survive without a transplant. In the meanwhile, I'll be here, doing my best to keep it together. While you were anxious about providing food for David and his kid, there was a brief moment of stillness on the other end. "Edward, as Charlotte's father, how could you allow things to become this bad?" Sharp Harper's voice then rose again, this time much louder. "It's your fault that you didn't see this sooner." I was staring at the wall, my eyesight blurry from crying, and it was all your fault. "Charlotte," I whispered in a state of tiredness and fury, my voice quivering, "since you weren't." We continued to argue loudly until a doctor walked in and gave me the silent treatment. I hung up with Charlotte, gestured for her to be quiet, and the room was silent once again, with the exception of. I returned to my seat beside Mason's bed, placed my head in my hands, and felt my pulse race in time with the machine's incessant beeping. Seemed as if it were crumbling beneath the strain of my possessions, including a wealth that may resolve a great deal of issues, but at that instant, I was overwhelmed with a crushing sense of poverty. Mason's health would not be restored by monetary means, and my marriage would remain fractured regardless of how much I tried. There was no amount of money that could alleviate the crushing sense of shame and isolation that gripped me as I waited for it. Amazingly, when my dad, Nicholas, stepped in, the room was dead silent. As usual, his presence was commanding and attention-grabbing. He came up to me, his face a mix of compassion and firmness. With a quiet voice, he said, "How is Mason doing?" As his keen eyes swept over the many monitors and equipment connected to her. Almost respectfully, I shook my head, at a loss for words, and instead made a motion toward the doctor who had been overseeing Mason's case. Nodded, and Nicholas stepped away for a private conversation while I remained sitting at her side. Mason lay on her bed, clutching her little hand, quietly wishing that we would manage to make it through this ordeal by the time Nicholas came back. Her blood type is uncommon, so finding a donor is a challenge, the doctor told me as he sat down next to me, and his mood was grim. "Won't be a picnic," I nodded in agreement. I had heard the same thing from them. For a split second, Nicholas finally spoke up, asking the question I'd been dying to hear. "Where is Charlotte?" I let out a loud breath and leaned back in my chair. I exclaimed angrily, "My chair isn't here," and Nicholas arched an eyebrow. "It's difficult to interpret what you're saying," so I informed him about Charlotte's never-ending absence, her fixation with David and his baby, and the fact that she had entirely forsaken us at the crucial moment. I let out every last drop of my pent-up rage and disappointment when it came to her the most, like a dam about to explode. My voice was icy as I told you, Mom, that she had failed. Mason is laying here, battling for her. Charlotte is engrossed in her role as rescuer to David and his child, but she neglects her own life in the process, remains oblivious to the impact it has on her own family, while Nicholas attentively listens, his face becoming more stern with each word. After I finished speaking, he sighed slowly and deliberately, Edward, and he raised his voice. Calm yet tempered with a dash of grit, this scenario can't go on until Charlotte puts her family first. Then you must act. By nodding, I indicated that I understood the situation and proceeded to pick out my phone to make a call. Addressing Gabriel, whom I had complete faith in, I said in a quiet but strong voice, I need monitoring services for 2 individuals, David and Charlotte. I am interested in knowing their whereabouts, activities, and conversations. Nicholas gave me a long, critical glance as I ended the call, clearly intending to cover all bases. I looked back at Mason with a hard swallow, as he warned me to be ready for what may be waiting for me if I did as he suggested. She was the one source of strength that allowed me to confront the chaos that Charlotte's actions had caused, which had caused such a chasm between. I was worried it would be forever broken, but at this moment, everything was about my kid, and I was prepared to confront the truth the day before if it meant saving her, but I would do whatever it took to keep her safe. Concerned that Mason's health had not improved, I felt as if a knife were slicing deeper into my heart with each passing hour. I felt a sudden pain in my chest. Then Charlotte contacted David's son and said, I'm paying for his treatment, without using the preamble. Her tone was so casual, as if it were second nature. I tightened my teeth and fought the need to interrupt. Stay cool, Charlotte. I spoke carefully and asked why it was your job, if someone else has. Edward. I wanted to shout at her to make her realize that helping her was more important than sitting on her hands and doing nothing. We're completely incorrect, but I failed to see the sense in engaging in pointless arguments with her. At the moment, my attention was devoted to Mason. I ended the call without continuing. Later that night, the doctor came to visit me, and his expression was grave. Upon meeting Mr. Mateo, we discovered a sudden rush of optimism and anxiety. I felt a wave of relief when I found a kidney that matched Angie's uncommon blood type. It was like finally getting a break. Optimism, but his countenance became gloomy as he persisted. Yet, the message was transmitted. One of Angie's parents authorized the kidney to be given to another child. Even though Angie was initially at the top of the list, I felt my chest constrict with anger and confusion as his words finally registered. What on earth do you mean? Wanted to know who authorized the transfer. The doctor paused, visibly uneasy, and whispered something about your wife. As the impact of his words sank in, Charlotte, the room whirled around me. I raised my voice again, and our daughter offered her kidney to a boy called Elijah. The doctor nodded firmly in agreement. Unlike Angie, his injuries were not life-threatening. Nonetheless, he did suffer damage to one kidney. I'm doing my hardest to get a new donor for your daughter since she needs a transplant so badly. I just couldn't think of anybody else who could help. I was unable to exhale as a wave of fury surged through me. My fists clenched, and I fought against the need to. Mason was our daughter, but Charlotte had done the unimaginable by putting David's boy ahead of her own. While Charlotte was laying in that hospital bed, her life was precariously hanging in the balance, and she had signed away her shot of survival. My thoughts. Looking at the doctor, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, sadness, and thoughts about what type of mother she was. Keep looking, I replied, my voice quivering with barely restrained fury. Snipped, found another match, and did everything it took to follow in his footsteps out of the room. Sat down next to Mason's bed, his wrath directed at her frail and little figure as he stared. The fires of treachery raged inside me, but so did Charlotte's rekindled resolve. Let Mason down, but I wouldn't. I would risk everything for my daughter, even if it meant destroying the. Mason's life had been illuminated, and suddenly nothing, not even Charlotte, mattered. It had been 5 days and 5 long, and not even David could stop me. enduring excruciating days spent glued to Mason's bedside as she fought for her life while equipment beeped a gloomy. A constant reminder of how precarious her life had been, and Charlotte, who had failed to appear. Every day, I reminded myself that Mom would come since Mason was her daughter, but as the hours went into days, nothing changed. Days as my internal feelings of rage and incredulity intensified and eventually took on a more sinister hue. On day 6, the worst, how could she possibly avoid her own child? How could she put anybody or anything ahead of her own child? It all began when the machine's sirens went out, their frenzied screeching sending my heart tumbling into my. I remained still in the corner while a sea of anxious physicians, nurses, and patients surrounded Mason in the operating room. When they ultimately decided to IED her, the doctor took me aside, Mr. Mateo, and he stated, "Sadly, Angie's health has deteriorated to the point where she has fallen into a coma. We will keep an eye on her," but he then stopped speaking. I sat back down since I didn't need him to continue. I could see the battle was becoming tougher and that Mason was losing. With my head buried in my hands, I stood at her side as a crushing weight of despair weighed me down, and it was difficult to breathe. Yet underlying the sadness, a simmering, intensifying fury. "Gabriel," I answered my voicemail every single time my phone went out. "Ruff, what is it?" he said, and I could tell from his tone that Charlotte was going to be unimpressed. "She's been seeing David excessively, to the point where she's been sleeping with him, Edward, almost every day, and she's funding his lifestyle with your money." I clenched my fists, worried it would. "Gabriel, there's more to it than that." I growled something, my voice low and menacing. "It has come to my attention that David's wife passed away in an automobile accident, as I have been investigating. I'd be surprised if David wasn't involved, given the murky nature of the situation." I was overcome with fury as I saw my wife, the one I had put my confidence in and formed my life around, betray me in every way. By some stretch of the imagination, she had deserted our daughter, given David's boy her kidney, and was now lying in bed. I rose up, paced the little room, and kept watching them while I raised my voice, maybe in response to a guy who could be a killer. Fleeing in rage, I went back to Mason and demanded to know their every action after we ended the call. I had been patient and made an effort to comfort Charlotte, but her lifeless corpse was a sobering reminder of everything that she had discarded. It was the last straw when Charlotte deceived me after I had reasoned with her and attempted to keep our family together. There would be zero tolerance for Angie's betrayal of our family once she had already made her decision. Second chances, this was no longer about rage. It was about Angie's justice, and I felt bad for Charlotte and David because they didn't. Sensed a chillier than normal air that night in the hospital room, but maybe it was only a precursor to what was to come. Was just my disposition as I sat beside Angie's bedside, gazing at her lifeless, pale face. As I became more and more enraged by Charlotte with each beep of the monitors, I couldn't help but think about how precarious her existence had become. I buried the subject and focused on my kid instead. When Charlotte eventually stepped in, I said nothing to her. She was unworthy of my harsh comments. Nicholas, who was standing by the window, gave her a disapproving glance. Angie's doctor walked in and described her increasing situation, but she avoided meeting his look, as if frozen in time. Despite the fact that we weren't in need of a reminder, Charlotte surprisingly consented to. It was the least she could do since this was her kid as well, so I didn't even thank her for getting her blood checked. Suddenly, just as abruptly, she departed, leaving Angie without so much as a consolation or an explanation. No solace. The doctor arrived that evening to break the news. It was as if she couldn't get out of there quickly enough. Because with Charlotte, I had a glimmer of hope, but the burden of her past actions crushed it. I caught a portion of the discussion in which Charlotte was asked what she had failed to do later that night when the doctor phoned her, and instead of saying, "I will consult Edward before making a final choice," shortly after my phone broke, Charlotte's, "I will be as distant and methodical as before," responded. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to talk to her. "Edward." Her tone was so nonchalant it crawled up my spine. I know I stated it bluntly, but crawl. I'm a match. She went on to say, I was about to burst out laughing because, of course, Angie had a disease, and I would be happy to donate a kidney to her. David and his kid would be able to live well if you sent him $20 million, according to her. The price she charged for the nice life was unbearable, and I couldn't. Our daughter's life was in jeopardy, and she was exploiting the situation to her advantage, according to what I was told. I remained silent while she prodded Edward, almost anticipating my words about her boyfriend and his kid. I hung up and sat there silently, hands clenched, refusing to comply. Clenched my fists. My knuckles became white from the sheer brazenness and brutality of it all. Charlotte had sunk so low that she was bringing our family down with her, but this was far from done at this point. As I stood beside Angie's bed, I vowed to battle for Charlotte and make sure she paid for her treachery. Nicholas stood at my side, his stern, and the only sound that broke the silence was the gentle buzz of the monitor. Angie's little, delicate frame provides a stable foundation amongst the whirlwind of my feelings. Remained still, a sobering symbol of everything that I had to give up, and suddenly Charlotte entered the room, seeming as calm as usual. Without fail, her eyes ran over me as she entered the room where her daughter lay desperately battling for her life. "Well, Edward," she said, her gaze quickly shifting to Nicholas before returning to me. I faced her squarely, my expressionless face telling her, "Have you made your decision?" Her tone was sharp and professional. "Charlotte, I want you to realize that," I said in a quiet, steady voice, "if I am going to refuse to. I take it that Charlotte betrayed Angie, leading to her death and the death of our daughter?" With an unwavering face, she told Edward, "If you can live with it, then so can I." Her words struck a chord. "So, you can live without your child?" I questioned, my tone laced with silence, as if it were a strike to the stomach, but I didn't flinch. In her enraged state, she had a harsh, dismissive grin on her face and said, "I'll divorce you and marry." There was a little period of heavy quiet as she continued, "David, and have another child." The temperature in the room dropped a few degrees. While our conversation, Nicholas came forward and took a folder out of his jacket. "It seems like you may have forgotten something," he said. With a steady but firm tone, Nicholas gave her a copy of the prenuptial agreement she had signed. Charlotte's expression became pale as she turned the pages of the document, and she finally snapped when she realized what it meant. With a tiny quiver in her voice, Nicholas continued, "You've lost everything." He then tapped a button on his phone. The room was flooded with the distinct sounds and sights of her and David sharing a passionate embrace as the film began to play. Charlotte's face became ashen as her treachery was vividly portrayed. "You had me in your clutches." Afterwards, she stumbled over her words, her nerves fraying, and Nicholas remained silent as well. I just gazed at her, allowing her to see the contempt and revulsion radiating from my eyes. I eventually spoke, but my voice was icy and dispassionate. "Angie will live," I said. Charlotte's expression changed from indifference to what seemed like genuine panic as her eyes widened. But she remained silent. She had already chosen the path that separated her from her kid and her family, and now I would transfer my heavenly and terrestrial possessions to Angie, Charlotte, and David. Weren't much more than roadblocks, and I would overcome them in a manner befitting my newfound focus on. I watched Charlotte leave the scene of the crime because I was determined to protect my daughter no matter the cost. Despite having just wrecked the place, she walks confidently across the room, her back straight and her heels tapping on the hospital floor. As soon as she disappeared from view, the icy rage that had been building within of me exploded. When she got back, she was probably already en route to David, hatching plans for their future together. Murmuring in the darkness, each of them certain of their own superiority. I refused to give in, but I was aware of what would she do next? David, ever the opportunist, had likely advised her to use the domestic abuse grounds for a divorce, push me into a corner by using my anger against me and dragging it out in court. I wasn't like them. I wasn't until I was broke that they could see how determined I was to repay them. I was prepared to let this continue, but as I stood there, my anger boiling over, I realized I needed to think forward since my daughter's life was in jeopardy and I would not stand for their using her as a pawn. I grabbed for my phone and dialed Gabriel's number, speaking in a tone that was calm yet tense. Gabriel understood just what I meant. He'd been aware of it for a long time. Soup maker scent. For a long time, using the soup maker was the most effective method of dealing with issues and finding solutions when no one else could. Charlotte and David were still thinking about this when I ended the call, and a feeling of gloomy pleasure washed over me. I would ensure that they learned for the time being, because they were in power yet confused about who they were dealing with. Returned to Angie's bedside, my focus refocused on her need for me. Everything else might burn, but she needed me. Wouldn't bat an eye, but I would defend Charlotte and David from anything came their way so long as she fought. Leather seats and polished wood furnishings, reflecting the gentle light, filled the lawyer's office for them. The room was lit by recessed lighting. There was a subtle aroma of high-end perfume and freshly brewed coffee in the air, and the walls were adorned with. David and Charlotte sat in front of a huge, polished bookcase filled with legal TS, each one as shiny as the previous. While they sat silently at the desk, with just the sound of coughs and the movement of their weight on the comfortable seats, for which they had to wait 20 minutes, and the air tension in the room became thicker by the second. David sat with his arms crossed, his gaze restlessly roving the room, while Charlotte sat forward, her hands clasped together. Nervousness radiating from her face as she clutched the object in her lap. The door to the office swung wide, and a guy dressed in a. As soon as Gregory Anderson stepped into the room, his commanding presence radiated across the space. With an air of self-assuredness, he glanced over Charlotte and David before settling into his seat, spending no time on the small talk, so Gregory leaned back in his seat and folded his hands. Charlotte took a deep breath and kept her voice level as she said, "What can I do for you today? I want to apply for. Edward Mateo and I are divorcing," and Gregory arched his eyebrows slightly. When Edward's name was brought up, he leaned forward, palms on desk, and his expression remained expressionless. "Now that your name has so much weight," Edward Mateo replied with a more cautious tone. "What's your reason?" Charlotte was hesitant to file for a divorce until she finally declared, "He's been abusive. I can no longer tolerate his physical and mental abuse." Gregory showed no fear but instead leant in. With his intense stare fixed on hers, he said, "Do you have any evidence of this abuse?" Charlotte's expression hardened as she answered. She drew her attention down, and I didn't gather any proof because I was terrified. Unfortunately, Gregory didn't seem affected by her explanation. Instead, he waited for Charlotte to glance up at the guy he was staring at, inquired, her voice becoming lower as she looked at David and then back at him. David sat down next to her. Looking at Gregory with narrowed eyes, he said, "This is David. He's my friend." Waited a minute before speaking, carefully studying her. Then, with a calm but straightforward voice, he said, "I need to ask you, do you intend to wed David and steal Edward W.'s money? If so, I must know, Charlotte, since I am an A." Charlotte's face became pale as she hesitated, looking at David briefly before returning her gaze to the question. Gregory, feeling the impact of his comments on her, squirmed uneasily in his seat. Despite this, they remained silent for a while. "Charlotte, I need you to tell me the truth about the divorce, particularly because Gregory wasn't finished for a long time. If your objective is to utilize this as a means, we cannot casually include someone like Edward Mateo. In order to access his funds, I will not proceed with the lawsuit." Charlotte's eyes briefly fluttered with a mixture of shame, terror, or maybe. "I'm not chasing his money," she answered quickly, but her voice betrayed her true feelings, was lacking in conviction. "All I want is to escape his clutches and live my life freely." Gregory fixed his gaze on her for an additional second before. He sat back in his chair and let out a sigh, his countenance betraying his lack of full buy-in. After giving it some thought, he eventually agreed, "I'll investigate your case. I need to talk to you more about this. Just so you know, taking this on won't be a picnic. I really need to know that you're up for the challenge." True to her word, Charlotte never plays games or tells fibs. With a swift nod, Charlotte conveyed her understanding of. Back into her voice, "I get it. I'm pleading with you, Gregory, to lend me a hand." Arose to indicate the conclusion of the meeting. "You can expect to hear from me as soon as I've had a chance to." Taking care of Charlotte while he reviewed your case, He went to David, and then returned to Charlotte. Charlotte could sense the mounting tension between herself and David as they departed from the office, burdened by the conversation's weight. Gregory's remarks weighed heavily on her thoughts, but she was resolute in her refusal to back down. Charlotte and David sat in David's flat living room, the air filled with anticipation, as if everything she desired was within reach. Their dispute had simmered for days, and with each passing hour, their frustration level had been steadily rising. Their angry comments were drowned out by the hardness of David's smash, making the quiet hum of the city outside seem like a distant memory. "You assured me that Edward would give up, and now he's clenching his fist and looking furious as he does so." Charlotte's face became more expressionless as her voice became more frustrated. Seated back in her chair, she masked it with a practiced grin, attempting to reclaim control of the discussion. As she casually crosses her arms, he tries to appear as if he doesn't see the intensity in her gaze. "David, I know him better than anybody, and I know that he will bend to my will. All I have to do is show him my charm, and he will melt." Leant forward, his hands resting on his knees, and gave her a doubtful expression, as if to say, "Do you really believe that? He is not an idiot. He is a strong guy, and Charlotte is worried that he is finished with you." Charlotte's eyes shot across the room as she asked. She said in a low voice, her rage barely restrained, "Trust me, David. It's just a matter of time before Edward, who is notoriously dangerous, gives in to me. He's always been this way. I have a knack for getting under his skin, for making him feel guilty, and for making him feel weak, particularly when it concerns his daughter." David's jaw clenched. "You really believe he's going to let you go? I'll use it against him, as I have in the past." Charlotte let out a sigh and leaned back, as if the burden of all that had transpired was pressing down on her. This whole discussion was just a major pain. The point isn't to bully David. Rather, it's to motivate him to understand the depth of his dependence on me. He wishes for Angie's survival, and I am the one entity capable of ensuring it. Moderated her expression as she discussed their daughter Angie, her expression hardening into a commanding presence. Edward would stop at nothing to ensure that. David watched her intently for a minute before speaking, but ultimately decided to keep her alive even if it meant giving in to our demands. Was tempted to put his faith in Charlotte, thinking that her manipulative skills would lead to a successful outcome, but as he began to doubt her claims, Charlotte's words pierced through his growing doubts about their ability to handle the issue. Edward constantly gives up when it counts. Despite his confident and polished ideas, he never really has the upper hand. I've spent years getting to know him and his habits, so when the moment is perfect, he won't be able to resist my advances. His brows narrowed as he begged me to preserve his daughter, and he ate from my hand. Are you sure about? Charlotte's grin was deliberate and measured. Believe me, David, I am aware of what I'm. David remained skeptical, but Charlotte's eyes revealed a fiery intensity that I couldn't ignore. Edward Mateo was no match for me. Her self-assurance caused him to stop. She had an uncanny knack for getting what she wanted, and he wondered whether she was correct about Edward. If they could regain control of him, they could have what they wanted in an instant. David gave in for a moment. With Charlotte's scheme, maybe she might convince Edward to give in, and then they could finally have. David and Charlotte waited outside the hospital, in the fresh, chilly air, ready to finish all they had been working on. While they made their way to their vehicle, the stress of the previous several days mounting with each passing moment. David's son had been released, and they had finally achieved, so there was a feeling of hope in the air. They seemed to be making progress toward their goals, with everything falling into place as they strolled along. Despite his unassuming attire, just a blazer and jeans, an air of mystery about the guy as he approached them, distinguished himself by speaking to David first with a heavy Spanish accent. "Pardon me, guys, but I have a..." David looked at Charlotte for a second before returning his gaze to the guy, his interest piqued. "Sure," David said, his tone betraying his eagerness. The guy smiled slightly, but his expression was one of guardedness. He glanced at David from head to toe before shifting. Charlotte caught his attention, and he seemed to assess her for an instant. His voice was kind but unwavering as he spoke once again. As if it were a bowl of soup, David furrowed his brow in perplexion. The query seemed out of place, too weird to be anything. He drew back, his stomach nodding at the thought of it as more than just a joke or an awkward effort at small talk. Shared a bewildered expression with Charlotte, and before they could answer, the man's mood altered. David's instincts begged him to take action, but he couldn't respond in time as his expression hardened and he went for his jacket. A group of swift, stealthy, and effective individuals soon joined the guy. Swiftly encircling the two with hardly a peep of noise, one of the men, a stocky man with a snarl, drew a revolver, went to the vehicle, aimed it squarely at David, and gave the guy a chilly command. David's thoughts raced while his voice remained steady, as if he were a model student. He was unable to comprehend what was occurring, but he could feel Charlotte's arm resting on his side and also feel her presence. Uncertainty, feeling helpless due to their numerical disadvantage, and the presence of a firearm in the man's possession, David cast a sidelong look. Looking down at his kid, who stood only a few feet away, the guys seemed to sense his hesitancy and one of them grinned with an unervingly keen grin that you may want to. In a low, sarcastic voice, the guy replied, "Protect him." He inclined his head slightly to show his mockery. With an evil grin on his face, he assured David, "I won't miss you." The words struck him like a blow to the stomach. His kid, the one thing that meant more than anything, caused his heart to sink and his blood to run cold, was in imminent danger. The danger was obvious, and a tidal surge of terror washed over him. With his son's safety hanging in the balance, David gulped hard and locked eyes with Charlotte in silence. Imploring her to comprehend, she subtly nodded, her expression becoming more resolute, and gradually the two of them. They started to make their way toward the vehicle, the guys maintaining a safe distance despite the stifling effect of their proximity. While the world whirled around us, the van jerked to a halt, the motor idle, and a sense of impending doom settled over us. The air was heavy with an unnerving stillness, as if something sinister were about to be revealed. It was a soggy day with a thick, gloomy sky when the guys in the vehicle stepped out first. Then they turned to eject David and Charlotte. Clouds as they made their way over the unkempt dirt trail. The deserted barn up ahead cast a foreboding shadow, and as he took each stride, the commanding David found himself being pulled farther and more into something he couldn't escape. Unable to contain herself, Charlotte strode over to be at his side, her face becoming pale as she remained silent. There was a distinct odor of hay and rust as the guys took them inside the barn, the sound of their footsteps resonating through the empty room. As they made their way inside the dimly lighted barn, the mystery guy who had before, he abruptly turned to face them, his expression changing from icy to intense. "I wanted to take you to my kitchen," he whispered, overflowing with an unnerving serenity, "but alas, this is the United States of America, not Mexico. It's just too difficult to construct a kitchen here." Apart from the fact that we must act swiftly, David felt a shiver go down his back, but the guy seemed unfazed as he retrieved an iPad, taken it from his jacket, and sneered at it as he tapped the screen in frustration. "This technical stuff annoys me," whispered, "but hey, I still have work to do." He immediately put in a call, and before he knew it, Edward's face was on the other end. David was taken aback by the sight of Edward's face on the screen, but before he could gather his thoughts, the guy navigated the iPad to Charlotte Edwards' profile, where her voice pierced through the speakers, his comments easing the tension in the room. "Welcome to the barn." Charlotte Edwards had a steady, icy voice that sounded like a blade. "Before you wonder what's going on or why it's happening, let me explain. I'm just trying to save my daughter, just as I said she would. Survive, even if it meant giving up another life at the same time you begged for funds to preserve the life of the kid you were carrying. This wasn't about getting even or being furious. It was about you leaving your baby in your belly and ceasing to be her mother. It was about rescuing Angie, no whatever the cost." And now Edward's voice was shifting to, "Elijah will be better off without you as a parent, David. I won't be raising him, but I will look after him. I will inform him that you were an awful parent and a pitiful human being because you compromised your values for financial gain." While a person's life was dwindling away, David's thoughts were detached from the concept of performing the game manipulating to get what he wanted without fully thinking through the repercussions. Now Edward. There would be no second chances. He had already planned his brutal next move. Charlotte's face twisted in anger as her attention shifted back to the guy holding her. Her wrath transformed into perplexity as she listened to Edward's comments. As if anticipating an unexpected development, the guys around them remained icy and silent as they observed the iPad. A guy lunged forward, seized Charlotte's arm, and drew out a weapon before she had a chance to respond. As soon as the needle was inserted into Charlotte's arm, her muscles immediately relaxed and her eyelids fluttered. Charlotte's vision began to haze as the guys hurriedly lowered her onto the stretcher and hurried her to a corner of. As one moved farther inside the barn, the air seemed heavier, as if the structure were holding its breath. The shadows cast by the surrounding. The atmosphere was so stifling that David briefly doubted whether he was really awake or engrossed in a terrifying nightmare. He hardly paid attention to the din as his thoughts raced through a whirlwind of rage and bewilderment. The guy who had presented Edward's comments earlier, the one carrying the iPad, turned to confront the dread. David questioned me, "Where are my manners?" with a chilly grin on his face. His voice was quiet, but unnervingly soothing. I said. Santiago Mesa Lopez, often known as El Pasalo or the Supmaker, took a moment to allow me to speculate for a second, letting the name dangle like a thread ready to be ripped at any second. He glanced across at Charlotte, who lay still on the bed. At least she was the spouse or one of four. The man's nonchalant tone sent a jolt of terror through David's body, making his pulse pound. Ensured that, whatever it was, Santiago's grin never wavered as he continued through his twisted world. His expression changed as he returned his attention to David, his words piercing through. With the stress like a blade, "You must continue your journey. Therefore, if you could kindly." As soon as he subtly signaled, the guys around David rushed in before David could respond. Was about to respond when they grabbed him and slammed a black bag over his head, but he resisted and felt a wave of panic wash over him. Arteries, but it of no good as the black sack engulfed him and the cords swiftly shackled his ankles and wrists. Certain that his effort was for nothing as he was hauled up off the ground, his body contorted in an awkward manner by the ropes. As they pulled him someplace, the sound of footfall rang around him, digging into his body with every stride. In a distant location, away from Charlotte's unconscious state on the bed, a sense of powerlessness engulfed him, and the shame he felt was like a knife piercing through his soul. They treated him like a commodity, something to be used and then discarded. The sound of Santiago's laughing reverberated around the room as David struggled to speak, his voice muted by the back. He told me to relax and enjoy the voyage since I would soon find out about the darkness. The guys continued moving forward without pausing or responding, and his amused tone permeated every word he said, pulling David more into the chasm, the men's relentless progress obliterating all chance of escape for him. Regardless of what was coming next, the unrelenting beating in his chest left him unable to stop it. I knelt down in the doctor's antiseptic, brightly illuminated hospital corridor, my hands folded. I could still hear his words, but they seemed hollow and far away, like the 2 kidneys he had mentioned. Like if we hadn't just organized anything, as if this weren't some ordinary medical operation. The doctor grinned almost too broadly, as if he were pleased with himself, as he twisted and darkened to save my daughter. In addition to Mr. Mateo, your daughter's kidneys were also affected by the deal cannabis. Now this is really wonderful, I murmured absent-mindedly, my gaze flitting to the operation's entrance. On the other side of the room, Angie was probably getting ready for surgery as the faint sound of equipment and people's voices filtered through. No matter how many times I tried to break through the barriers, I just couldn't muster the emotion of joy. It wasn't only a comment about her health. What had transpired was also something she deserved. I said, my voice barely audible. It revolved on the events leading up to this moment, the lengths I had gone to ensure her survival, and Nicholas stood silently at my side, knowing that his grin spoke all, as we stood there remembering the cost of that life. He was aware of everything that had to be done in order for us to get those kidneys, even the amount we had to pay. Now that the agreement had been done, there was no turning back. The repercussions would come, but for the moment, all that counted was. My thoughts reverted to Charlotte, who had departed as intended, and now that Angie was my only focus, I could care less about her survival than ever. Upon reuniting with Angie, I had a peculiar clarity in the knowledge that I had ensured her abandonment by Charlotte. The world might judge me for what I did, but I had done what was needed to rescue my kid. I decided that Angie would be my duty, and no one, not even her mother, the doctor, could oust me from her. Kept on going on about the operation and how tough the rehabilitation would be, but his comments seemed pointless. I looked across at Nicholas, my expression becoming more serious as the pressure mounted, and I realized that Angie was in that room because of me. After the shock of what I had done wore off, I reassured her that she would be okay by speaking softly. "I would rather have it that way than anybody else," Nicholas said with an unwavering grin. I knew for a long time that my actions would haunt me no matter what, but right now, it wasn't. I strode toward the operating room door, ready to face anything came my way, as long as Angie's life was still intact. The battle wasn't over. There was still more work to be done and choices to be made, but right now despite being miles away in a dark kitchen hidden away, I had rescued my kid, and that was all that mattered at the moment. In a remote farmhouse, Santiago Mesa Lopez faced a massive pot. The gentle glow of the fire illuminated the room, casting long shadows as he meticulously mixed the ingredients. His calm hands were evident as he made the most recent batch of pool soup, for which he had become renowned. Despite the fact that the components were unexpected, David is now laying bits near his life. Played a game of control over power and vengeance, and sacrificed for it. As Santiago persisted with his work, he grinned to himself, his mind distant and unfeeling, while the delicious fragrance of the soup wafted through the air, hung heavy in the air, and it wasn't only the spice that remained. Something sinister, deeper, his posel, had an exquisite flavor, and tonight it would taste even better since it. Angie's life hung in the balance as she had been coming, far from the horrors that Santiago was concocting. It had been a long and arduous journey, but Edward's daughter had just awakened, and the doctors were confident that the procedure would be successful. Been a success. The two kidneys were an exact match, and her body was reacting well to the procedure. A flicker of life flickered over her delicate, pale face as she cautiously opened her eyes, her pupils fluttering against the light. Under the soft illumination of the hospital room, the doctor stood by her bedside, his expression one of cautious hope as he roused her from her slumber. In a voice tinged with joy, he made the announcement. "The kidneys are a perfect match, Mr. Mateo. Her body is responding well." Edward stood at the foot of the bed, filled with optimism that she would recover completely and that her body will take the kidneys. As his gaze locked upon his daughter for the first time in what seemed like an age, he experienced a wave of relief, a triumph over. His efforts had been for nothing, but Angie was still alive and had a greater chance of recovery than they. Edward grinned, his expression sincere despite his exhaustion, and said, "Oh yes, the body will." Acknowledge without a doubt that the words were said with conviction, even if they had a great deal of meaning, and that the events leading up to this. At that instant, all the efforts and sacrifices had been worthwhile because of this one outcome, yet hidden under that grin, the shadows remained, and he still couldn't shake the memory of Charlotte and David's failed attempt to use his daughter's existence as a negotiating chip. They had reduced her to that by using her as leverage, but for the time being, Edward allowed himself a sigh of relief and happiness that his daughter was still alive and that Elijah, the youngster, was now far away beginning a new life with a childless couple in Mexico that Gabriel had set up, having previously been in Charlotte's care. Assured that the kid would be cherished, nurtured, and brought up as their own. The vow was faithfully followed, and Elijah remained safe. But, after becoming a part of Santiago's horrific legacy, the blood of treachery, David would never again be able to rest easy, had tarnished the palms of all those concerned, but Edward had emerged victorious. Now, he cast his gaze downwards at Angie. He spoke gently, "You'll be okay now," as he regulated his breathing and gently stroked a stray hair off her forehead. Confiding in her as if addressing the cosmos, he had, whatever the consequences, made the correct decision. Despite the overwhelming noises emanating from the hospital, he had no choice but to face the night and defend his daughter with all his might. Edward felt a peculiar blend of satisfaction and remorse as he paced the room, knowing he had done what was necessary, yet the worries about his decisions and their consequences, and eventually, Angie would be interested in knowing her thoughts as well, but he believed she was secure for the time being. Just what Edward needed. 2 weeks later, he petitioned for a divorce on the grounds of desertion and was eventually successful. Anyone might have cared less about Charlotte's whereabouts after a year. Therefore, I implore you, dear listeners, to leave a remark with your opinions. Area down below, and be sure to subscribe, like, and share.